Hello, welcome to the Rubric eLearning Roundtable. With the rise in global online learning, it's more important than ever that you localize your e-learning courses for your international markets. At Rubric, we work with global companies to streamline their localization processes, and a significant part of this is the problem-solving stage. Now, every client is different, so a huge part of working with Rubric is the kind of strategic magic that happens when we discuss a problem and solve for the needs of that particular client or new project. So in this roundtable, we're going to be looking at some of the hypothetical situations around e-learning. Now, we're using hypothetical situations so that we keep the confidentiality of our existing clients. But here we've got some project managers and experts from Rubric who are going to be talking about what is important when we're localizing e-learning content, and we'll be problem solving for some of those hypothetical situations. Now, the first situation we're going to bring to the table here, we've got someone coming in from a company and they just have e-learning content that they need to be translated. They're sort of ground zero, they don't know anything. What do they need to know? What's the first steps that they should be thinking about?
So the first thing we need to know about localization of e-learning is having the right authoring tool. Ideally, you should have some sort of tool that can export and import content for translation easily. So for instance, there's tools like Lessonly, which kind of require translation to be done on the platform itself because you can't export it or import it quite easily. Rise, however, can do that, Articulate Rise, and one of my clients, they were able to switch over to that, and rather than have in-house translators who were not actually translators, they just happened to speak the language, they're now able to have actual translators translate that content and localize it correctly. And another important feature to make note of is whether a platform actually offers dynamic resizing, so that languages that have longer words or sentence structures, like German, for instance, instead of being cut off where English would cut off at character limits, it actually resizes a page so that a whole word can fit. Also, having a platform that can be adapted to whether the audience uses mobile or PC or tablet to actually access that content is pretty useful to have.
Okay. And you mentioned having like in-house translators there who are not translators. Is that quite common?
Sometimes in the initial stages when they haven't had a localization plan, that can happen. And it's not always a bad thing if they know what they're doing, but you can have, it's best to have someone that's dedicated to the actual translation job to translate the content and localize it.
They may have someone who speaks German, but they may not have anyone for French and Italian. And then, the process doesn't work anymore and they have to look outside. And that's when they realize that they can't export the content, for example. So, thinking ahead, will this work for, another 5 languages? Is this just a short-term solution, but not a long-term plan? I think that would help if they consider that.
Okay. What's the difference when you're just creating for one language compared to?
Well, I think when you are thinking about launching a module in different markets or in different languages, you have to think about your module or your assets in general. If they were created originally with the thought of launching them into different markets, then great, you have a good part of the job completed because you have thought of all the little things and all the moving parts in that module or that video that you want to localize, and you know that things can change. But if, for example, you didn't think about those things when you were developing or creating your assets, then you might need to go back into your English modules to make some changes and make it localizable. There's things like focusing on repeated text and sentences that can be used in many contexts. Like, it's useful to paraphrase, and it might be necessary when you are doing things like assessments or quizzes when you want to test the understanding of a lesson. but there are some sentences that will be repeated across the module, and that there are some concepts that don't need to be rephrased. So repeating those sentences, I mean, some examples might be next, or you've reached the end of the lesson, this is your result, things like that. Simple but complete sentences that can be used in repeated scenarios that can help reduce the cost of localization greatly. I mean, these are things that are very repeated throughout e-learning. I think some other concepts that you will need to take into account when creating that module, and if you haven't thought of that before creating it, then you might need to go back and look into it, would be multimedia, like minimizing the amount of videos or images that you need to use, because I mean, sometimes they're necessary, so your modules are engaging and people are looking forward to using them. But this also brings an extra layer of engineering and questions about the best way of localizing them, from deciding if you want to localize an image or just leave it in English, or to decide between if you want subtitles or voiceover when you localize videos. That's also something that will have a great impact on your costs and your budget.
So we've got this company coming in with their course, and I can imagine often what the situation is people are like, oh yes, I've got to put all of the interactive elements, I've got to do all of the videos because that's what we want from it. What sort of questions are you going to be asking them? What should they be looking at the content that they've already got in English?
Well, the first question I always ask is if you have the open files. That's the most common one, because sometimes companies might take a screenshot of a website, for example, and that's not a localizable element because it's just an image. So you will need an open file, or if you have an alternative for that specific market, that those questions are the ones that define the engineering cost down the line. So it's the best question to ask on those multimedia assets. Then I would say also, like, the big question: do you want it localized or not? Is it something that is essential for the learning outcome? Do you need that specific screenshot to be localized? And if the answer is no, then well, you can just leave those assets untouched. And if the answer is yes, then what are the parameters you need? For example, if it's a video, do you really need it to be voiced? Maybe subtitles are enough. Do you want to have different versions for each market, or just you need a hosting platform for that video that can allows you to upload different subtitle files?
I think to reiterate Irene's point, I think it's often about scalability, that what somebody might do if they're just creating e-learning for one language, normally in English, like you say, they might use all sorts of different features and quizzes and animations and interactions. But when you have to scale that up, and it might be 5 languages or 50 languages, that cost increases as well. So it's thinking about that when you're designing those elements. So is it a real video with actors, or can you do that in a way that is more efficient but gives the same kind of learner experience and is still effective in that learning message? Can you get it across in a different way that's much easier to localize and much cheaper to localize? So instead of using real actors and having to potentially re-record that situation entirely, can you do it in an animation and just have voiceovers that change? Animation works really well because you have a lot of options for extending frames, for example, so that you can fit the voiceover properly into that time and that space. Whereas with real video, that's much more difficult. So things like that, like Irene says, subtitles or voiceovers, what do your markets need, and how can you design content to make it scalable?
Along the same lines, I would say using images which contain text in them. You know, is the text in the image essential, or can it be actually written out as part of the course? Because you will not have to localize an image if you just use text that can be edited by the translator. So that will save the cost of having to replace the image in all the localized courses.
I think thinking one of the other areas is around the layout and the design. So if content has been designed for English and with the English content in mind, it might just fit in the available space. But a language like German, for example, the content will probably be longer. In Chinese or Japanese, it will be shorter. So if you make your layout and your design work for those languages, it can remove steps that might otherwise be necessary to fix things to make it work in the languages. So moving text boxes or resizing elements to make them fit, it's wasted effort and it's wasted cost, and you can engineer that out. You can remove the need for that by designing it with other languages in mind right from the beginning.
I guess once you've got 5 languages under your belt, you've already got that scalability in mind, hopefully. What's the jump? What, as a provider, like, what do you need to get that person from only thinking about training in English to thinking about it scaling in a scalable way?
I think it's just what you've said. It's a mindset shift about thinking first and foremost about localization, not thinking I'm designing for English and everything else is an afterthought. That when you design in English, that's one of the many languages that this will go into. And having in mind that you're not only taking that English to serve your English-speaking audience and your learners, but that needs to work for all of the other markets and all of your other learners as well. So another example might be using more simplified plain language that avoids ambiguity, that's easy to understand and can really give you the best shot at ensuring your message is understood and learners are able to take on board the content itself, rather than using puns, for example, or jokes. These generally localize really badly. More simple, concise, shorter sentences that are easy to understood and that completely avoid ambiguity make it much easier. So again, it's that mindset and having those things in mind from the outset.
And I guess a lot of companies are going to be going, okay, well, I can scale it just by adding machine translation and AI voices and all of that sort of stuff. How possible is that? And what are the things you need to know?
Yeah, machine translation can be a very useful tool, especially in terms of cost and how quick of a turnaround you want. However, there are a lot of risks when it comes to the quality of those translations, especially when there's maybe a very it's called complex type of grammar structures, as in like Japanese, for instance, where it really matters how you say something and in what order. MT is not going to really understand that. So ideally, when you start thinking about using MT, you want to write things in a very short and succinct manner, and you don't want to really have any complexities really from the get-go. If even with a simple source, you can also have translators post-edit the machine translation to make sure that the style that your brand wants and the specific product names aren't mistranslated at the end.
You mentioned Japanese there, and one of the things that's interesting about learning is that it's different all over the world. And how do you take the learning needs of the different people in the different cultures into account when you're localizing the same course over multiple different markets?
Yes, I think the obvious statement that we all think about is people want to think the content is for them. I mean, even if it seems really an obvious sentence, it is really important to have that in mind when at the core of the designing process. When you want to launch an asset or a module in different markets, your demographics and cultural experiences will change. And it's really important to think about that before creating the text, scenarios, and even characters. I think For example, using Caucasian models when localizing for Asia, it's unlikely to work for them. If you're only thinking about this when planning for localization, this means that you have skipped a step. You will have to think about reshooting images or getting new stock images for different markets. If, for example, you use animations, I think it would be useful to think about that when with the development artist on different models and animations for different markets. This might add some time to the development process, but it will deem essential down the line when it is time to change those designs and it's time to change the animations for the different countries. I think another point is avoid culture-specific references like sport analogies. I think the American football versus European football is a big one, but maybe that culture has a different predominant sport like cricket, I don't know, or softball. And by thinking about this, I mean, maybe you still need to use that analogy, but you're thinking about the alternatives and you will avoid headaches down the line. I think the other big point is humor and idioms. They are likely to sound clever and engage in one market, and it is possible that they can be localized and work in some other markets, but it's likely to fail on most of them, or sound clunky when localizing.
And as teachers, the people that generate learning content tend to be teachers, and metaphors and those type of analogies are always part of teaching. How can you change the sort of the mind of your teachers? How do you stop them from thinking about things that are only suitable to their own culture?
Yeah, I think that's something as we've said before, it's about shifting that mindset, but sometimes it's also about thinking of what you're saying. I mean, maybe you want to use that analogy and that can be fine, but you have to think about what you're really meaning, because that information will also allow the linguist or the localization people to just make that change and make it sound natural in that other language.
Get your LSP involved in the design process, and they can advise on internationalization steps. So we could look at the content and advise on which elements potentially would not translate very well or work very well in the certain markets. So it's something that we can advise on if the client would like to preempt those problems coming up in the future.
I think as well, we also have cultural considerations, but I think there are technical considerations as well, or different learner behaviors that we need to account for. So some people might use Android phones instead of iPhones in a certain market. And if your course hasn't been designed to work on that platform, then people aren't going to be able to use it. So are people working on mobile devices or are they on PCs? And this can vary across markets. So I think having those conversations with your audience and your markets initially to figure out what do people need, what do they actually want, so that you don't end up in a scenario that a client of ours unfortunately has had, where you build your content and it just doesn't work for that market because they can't access it technology-wise.
The same situation may occur to do with people having different levels of access to internet. And in some countries, perhaps people are in the habit of downloading content on their home network so that they can watch it while they're traveling, rather than consume things on the go, because maybe internet access is expensive or is not very good, very slow. So these are all the things that you should consider up front and understand your audience and how they will consume the content.
Companies will often come in and say, okay, we want to do localization, but it's expensive and it takes too long. And all of these things sound great, but how can I do it without spending all my budget and time on localization? What are some of the things that we should be thinking about to reduce the costs and the effort of it?
I think it's almost counterintuitive, because when people think, oh, the translation costs too much, the localization costs too much, your first thought is to think, how can we reduce the costs at that stage? But often our advice to clients will be, we actually need to go back further in the process, go back to the beginning with how the content's authored, what features do you use, how scalable is it, to make sure that the English or the source content is designed in such a way that you can remove unnecessary cost or engineer out cost so that your localization cost is significantly reduced, but you're still getting the same learner experience and you're not sacrificing on quality. There might be thoughts of, oh, let's just use machine translation, or we can change all our human voiceover to text-to-speech voice instead. And it's balancing those things against the learner experience and the impact that it has on them. But always our advice would be, if it costs too much or if it's too time consuming, look at the English first. Let's think, what can we do to improve that? And then look at the localization process as a secondary step.
So let's say that this company like coming in does want to use machine translation or does want to use these ways to reduce it because they've heard that this is the way to make it cheaper.
Both machine translation and text-to-speech voiceover are really valid in some use cases, but it's really thinking about, is it right for me? That might be in terms of the content. So if your content is a manufacturing video showing somebody how to install a piece of equipment, that if there's an error, there might be a risk to life or somebody gets injured, we wouldn't recommend that be machine translated. The risk isn't worth it. It's often to do with volume of content as well. So if there are tens of thousands of words in your learning modules, then machine translation and post-editing or text-to-speech is often really valid. And I think there's more of an acceptance nowadays of text-to-speech voiceover. Certainly, it's improved in leaps and bounds in recent years. And I think we have a lot of clients who use text-to-speech rather than using voiceovers. It makes a huge difference to the cost on a project, but it's always that balance between cost and your learner experience.
So how can companies ensure that they're not wasting effort in translation? What are the kind of problems that occur if there is wasted effort?
I think it's usually, I mean, on our experience, it's usually the design maybe that's causing problems. You keep hitting roadblocks whenever planning for the launch of a new market or in a new company. And it's thinking about those potential launches when designing the course, what is critical. It's simple things like font, text orientation and distribution, space, colors used, animations. Those can easily become roadblocks or increase the engineering costs down the line. So thinking about those when planning and when offering your content are essential. Yeah, I think minimizing the multimedia to avoid those increase or more than increase unnecessary costs, because they are not really, you don't really need them. You can localize that content in a different way. And it's, yeah, this like knowing it's your, what if you need to use those multimedia and those images, have I created them in the best way, or can they be localized effectively? And maybe, for example, for videos, rather than having a person doing a free video of some instructions, for example, you want to have an animation with a script that you know exactly what words the character is going to say. So that way it's more scalable, and you can easily localize some sections and just move them around in your modules. And I think that's also very useful when translating, because you don't have to think about like specific words that have to fit the mouth movement in a video. That's something that animations are very, very useful for. And it will, like, having an animation will also help the engineers move around the content. So for example, if some languages expand, like German, that is, for example, like 30%, has a rate of around 30% expansion, you will allow the engineer to expand that video and not have to reshoot or not have clunky spaces there of not movement for the voice.
Another example for video would be if you're doing a how-to video, for example. Often those videos have piece to camera, so somebody talking to the camera and you can see their face. Again, that's very hard to localize. People might know that that's not for them. The person isn't speaking their language, but you can remove that and you might just have shots that show somebody's hands doing the actual steps themselves. And something like that is much easier to localize, much cheaper to localize. So it's, again, engineering out all that extra effort that you're not really getting your money's worth from it. It's not value for money. And the same is true as well for the content itself. In all things localization, words cost money. So thinking about your written content and whether that can be made more concise, or if you're a large company that has a large corpus of learning material, look at it as a whole and think, how can we best reuse some of this? So an example is we did a set of modules for a client some years ago, and there were about 60 lessons. And at the start and at the end of each of the lessons, the narrator spoke to the learners and said, welcome to lesson number 1. In this lesson, we're going to go over this and this and this. And at the end, they would say, now you've completed lesson 42, and so on and so on and so on. And each of those clips of audio had to be revoiced in a number of different languages, and all of that cost money. And we worked with that client to make that content generic. So instead of saying the lesson number, you just say this lesson. And then we could record that once and reuse it in every module. And the same is true across content authored by different people as well. Be consistent in your wording and your phrasing, and you can benefit from translation memory, and you can reduce that effort as well.
I think if you're not sure, consult the LSP and they will advise you on pitfalls that you can avoid. If using our experience, there's a lot of things you can avoid.
And I think with e-learning as well, I think it's a really rapidly changing landscape, and there can be a lot of different components involved. So there's written content, there might be audio, video, different multimedias, quizzes, games, and there can be a tendency to get a bit carried away with some of the features that are available and think, oh, this is really cool, it's really whizzy, let's include that in our course. But you're not thinking it through from a localization perspective. So it comes back to the idea that is key for us, is that all of your design and authoring decisions should consider multiple markets and consider things into the future as well. So you might not go into those markets now, but if it's an option, then future-proof your content by making those design decisions with localization in mind. And that's a scenario we come across quite often with clients. They'll have the content, it's been written, it's been in use for years in their English-speaking market, and now they want to localize it. But because it's been designed with just that one market in mind, those decisions haven't been made to enable that content to be done at scale and cost effectively and efficiently.
So it's almost that with every piece of content or every decision you make about an e-learning course, you should have a thought bubble going, and how will this affect localization?
Exactly.
And those decisions are going to be made by multiple people, usually by a whole team of people, because e-learning has so many different bits going into it. How do you manage all of those people and the different stakeholders?
As a localization company, we have experience working with multiple stakeholders. So in a e-learning project, you will have the designers, potentially you will have the client. There could be several vendors who design the e-learning content, and we can work with the different scenarios, and we help those companies get together, discuss as a group all the steps of the process and plan ahead. So from the point of design through localization and the testing, because testing is often the part that e-learning designers forget about. We've done the translation, off it goes, and then you realize there's all kinds of mistakes and issues, or you haven't thought through how you're going to test it and QA it and check if it's actually looks well in the final layout. So we like to think of those things ahead in advance of a project starting. We would collaborate either with a e-learning designer or the company designing the content, and ensure we have scheduled that in the timeline, that there is time to actually carry out the necessary testing, but also find out how we're going to do it. Is it as easy as sending links to the linguists who translate? Do we need to involve the client to sign off on the content, and we have a review round where they actually check all the content? So I think communication is key, and planning and having that kind of overview of the whole process from start to finish, not forgetting all these critical steps which guarantee success at the end.
Okay, so let's move on to the next challenge. We've got someone coming in who has content, they've localized it, and the people who are consuming that localized content don't appear to like it. It's not working. How can they what are the signs that it's not working for them, and where should they start looking to find the problem?
I think the first area is to ask, to discuss that with your learners or your end clients. What is the problem? Why don't they like it? Is it not culturally relevant for them? Is it about a product that they don't sell in their market? Is it that they don't like the translation? There are a number of different issues that can occur, and I think ideally you'd be trying to avoid that scenario by having discussions right at the very start of the authoring process and talk to all the different markets that are going to use this content and ask them what they want, what's going to work for them. Something like audio content in videos, do they want subtitles or do they need it to have a voiceover? And there can be differences between markets. And I think it's really understanding what the problems are and then going back in the process and trying to figure out how you can solve them, because I think there are all sorts of different barriers and it's understanding where they are. Is it linguistic or is it cultural? Is it technological that they can't actually access the content? And another way to figure out whether those problems exist is to look at the data. Most e-learning platforms and learning management systems have really helpful reporting and data analytics that allows you to see how your content is being used and by who in the different markets or the different languages. So that's a useful way to be able to look out for something that's an anomaly and something that you might need to address.
Say we've got this course that's already localized. What are the steps that we'd be taking to kind of fix it?
You would want to get that feedback, and that might take the form of going through a quality assurance phase. So you have your end learners review the content, or your in-market salespeople. You get that feedback and you make changes to the content so that it then meets their needs. And that might be linguistic changes or changes to imagery, changes to how the content is supported and on what platform and so on.
I would say that the way to avoid these situations is to ensure that feedback is built into the process. So while you're localizing, you're also consulting the in-market salespeople who know the market, who know their product, and they can give you specific feedback on whether the content is relevant, addresses their audience well. Also, ensuring that there is a QA step so that you're checking whether the translations appear well in final layout. Do they fit? Do they work in the graphic sort of design of the whole course? And this way you can potentially avoid all these issues further down the line and users complaining. And I would suggest that, ensure that also technical testing is part of the QA step, that you're actually checking it on the final platform where the course will be uploaded, as mistakes sometimes can creep in further down in the process. Not, a course looks great on this test platform, but once you put it in the final context, there is some technical glitches. Maybe something is not configured correctly and it doesn't interact properly with the customer's LMS. So all these elements should be considered, and they can be used to address an existing problem, but equally, if they're part of the process, they can help you prevent the problems occurring in the first place.
What are the things that you can do to build a process that is strong and will continue to work and improve over time?
Yeah, if the translation is the bit that really needs work, from the beginning, there's a few things that you can do to kind of reduce maybe the impact of maybe mistranslations or people being unhappy with the style at the end. And one of those is having some collaboration from the beginning of your in-market review people, either helping in the selection process of translators. So if we identify a team that might be able to work on this, we would get the assessment done and sent over to the client to review and pick, their favorite translator out of those. And during the process, before translation, it'd be good to have a style guide and a glossary created just with those key terms and the way that you want your brand to sound through this e-learning, these courses. And then at the end or throughout the translation process, having a way that translators could potentially collaborate with those review teams. Either I have a client who has Google spreadsheets shared so that the translator can ask a question and immediately get a response from the people who will be the end users or the in-market salespeople for that country. So that can help at least mitigate some linguistic issues down the line.
Yeah, and I think to reiterate Natasha's point, that feedback loop is really important, because there can be a tendency for people to say, oh, I don't like the translation, but it can be quite difficult to say why, or it's quite a subjective feeling of, well, I just don't like it. I don't like the style, or I don't like the tone. It's not that it's incorrect most of the time, or there are errors in it. It's just a personal preference. And the best way for translators to learn is to provide feedback so that they can take that on board, they understand what needs to be changed, and they can learn from it. And if you don't have that feedback loop, it becomes like a doom loop that things are never going to change and nothing's ever going to get better. It's only by having that collaborative relationship that you can improve, and you can improve quality and improve acceptance in the market of the content.
So let's move on to the next challenge, and it's the one that people tend to think about a lot, I think, which is technology. We've got someone who's looking for an e-learning authoring tool that supports localization. So let's go around and just talk about some of the features that they should be looking for in this authoring tool.
Yeah, so one of the key features to look out for an e-learning tool is the export and import function. How are you actually going to get the content to the translators, and do they need access to that specific platform to translate there, or can we put that through a translation management system so that translators can efficiently work on that content? You want to also have some, depending on what your content looks like, you want to have some ability to, QA or clean up the translations, just because languages might look different on the screen than they would in English.
You would also want to ensure that you can support different languages. If you're localizing to Arabic, then the content will have to display right to left, for example. You have to ensure that different fonts are supported. This can be, challenging with Asian languages or Arabic again. So considering those things up front is an important element that could surprise you further down the line if things are not appearing correctly. So we would recommend maybe some early testing. You can send some sample files to us and we will pre-translate them, and you can see, will this behave as I hope in this particular language setting? So you can kind of preempt certain mistakes from the outset and engineer them out and ensure that you're prepared for that.
Yeah, I think just to add on that is all the content localizable? Like, are you clicking on all, for example, in a quiz or in a game, are you clicking in all the steps and everything is popping out and everything can be editable? I think that's an important point. And if you can use it in all your platforms, maybe your customer is going to use it on a laptop, or is going to be used on a telephone. That also impacts the size of the fonts. You need to be aware of your audience before creating the actual assets.
Our focus is on localization, but I think it's also important to remember that is one consideration amongst many. So there will be other things that you need to consider about what features a tool has. And often with e-learning, we find that clients use a whole suite of tools. It might not just be one tool that does everything. They might create audio content in another tool or video in a video editing tool. So just to have an awareness that it might not be a one answer for everything, that there's a silver bullet piece of technology. You might need to choose from the best for each step, so that you're using a complete suite of tools that supports localization well, but also means that you can do everything you want your content to do.
The different providers of different tools often have different ways of describing different features that they have, which may or may not be similar. How can the company make sure that it is actually having the features that they really need?
I think the simplest way is to try it out. I mean, most software providers offer free trials nowadays, and we are a great advocate at Rubric of pilot projects. So if you are looking at 3 or 4 different candidates, for example, make sure that you are able to test them out fully and that you do a complete dry run of the process so that you're checking all of your content is exported for translation. That we've had cases where in an e-learning tool, most of the content is, but not the quiz content. That just goes somewhere else and doesn't get exported. So there was a need for a lot of manual rework there. So go through the whole process, talk to your localization service provider, understand what they need the tool to do, how they would use it if they're re-engineering the content as well, and making sure that it has all those features, but you know it has them because you've tried it out.
Pilot projects very important in Rubric. Let's say we've got a company who's coming along and they need to build a business case for e-learning. They know they need to or that person knows they need to localize their courses, but they need to convince everyone else. Where should they start in building that business case?
I think with localization in general, a challenge we often face is that localization is just seen as a necessary cost or a necessary evil. People know they have to do it and they should do it, but they don't really want to. But why are you doing that localization in the first place? And there's always a reason behind it. Is it because you want to increase sales in a market, or you want to improve customer service? And focus on that. If you have that content in English, what was your business case for creating the content in English? And it will probably be the same in other markets for other languages. So if you were, for example, looking to go into a new market where you forecast you had potential sales of $1 million a year, if you then put that into perspective of a localization cost of $50,000 or $100,000, it seems quite small in order to offer you that potential sales market. So rather than thinking of it just as a cost, where is the revenue driver behind that? Is it increasing sales or improving customer service, for example? And I think also thinking of it the other way, if we don't localize content, what effect might that have? And it might be you lose market share. It might be that people move away from your product because they want a product that is in the language that they speak, or you're just not going to get that market penetration in the first place. So think about both of those things, and I think that's a helpful approach when thinking about your business case.
How can you track that? What are the ways that you can make sure that that's working by using KPIs and data?
There's different ways a client might want to measure the value that the localized e-learning brings. One of our clients, for example, they look at their usage data and they will calculate the cost per user. So if the content was designed well, it's very popular, it makes the cost per user less and less. And that's a good indicator this was a successful localization effort and the content hit the mark with their audience. You can also look at other things that, perhaps this e-learning that you've developed has allowed you to bring efficiencies in your factory, for example, because the people who you've trained, thanks to that content, they can work more efficiently and the throughput has increased. So there's different aspects that you could measure potentially and see how your course is benefiting your business.
So we've got a company who is using how-to videos, very popular, in place of traditional e-learning. So they've just got the videos. What should they be considering when they're coming to the localization of those videos?
Things to consider when localizing video. Potentially the first question would be, do you need subtitles or do you need voiceover? In certain contexts, perhaps users watch videos on mute when they're commuting on public transport, and actually doing the voiceover is a wasted effort, and you just want to provide them with subtitles so they can watch it quietly on their phones. On the other hand, when you provide voiceover, you might want to ask the question, does it have to be a human voiceover, or would a text-to-speech be a better fit and a way of saving costs? You could also consider if it's going to be machine translation or human translation. If the content is potentially very specialized and complex, it may be advisable to use only human translation. But if the content is very repetitive and structured well and using simple language, it might be suitable for machine translation. You would want to know how the users will watch the videos. Will they use their mobile phones while traveling, or will they use a PC and watch it on large screen? Would they want to download it and watch it offline so they can save on the data usage? Or would they stream? Would they watch the videos on YouTube, which has its own tools for uploading subtitles, versus a learning management system, which perhaps has other requirements? So I think understanding your audience and what is the appropriate channel for them to access the videos is key here. And understanding the demographic also would help you make certain decisions up front that your localized content will meet their expectations.
And how can you start to answer those questions? Because I guess there's, especially when you've got multiple markets and multiple different audiences, they're going to have different answers there.
Most companies, if they are designing e-learning, they already have people on the ground in the countries for which they're designing for, and they will be the first people to ask. They'll be the ones best placed to know and understand what their audience is. They may have experience with other content they do for that audience already locally. They may have some tips and advice from their own experience of just living in that country and things that you would not have thought, or considered from your perspective. So I think going to your in-market salespeople would be the best starting point.
And I think in an ideal scenario, we would always suggest to clients that you would look to create your content in such a way that would work for all of your markets. That's the ideal, so that you would look to create the content once and localize it rather than having to make a change for each market to make it work in every market. There are cases where you will need to perhaps have a number of different versions, but talk to your people in market, understand what they need. But wherever you can, aim to create one version that will work for as big an audience as possible.
Yeah, I think in scalability, what we think is, if it might work for your source video, like for English, but once you try to move it around different markets, this might not work. For example, if getting a work, like getting someone to do a video from your company just in the moment, a spur in the moment video, just a live one, that might work for English. But then when you're trying to localize that, you are not thinking about, like, for other markets, if that's going to work or if it's going to be cost effective. If on the other hand you script a video, and for example, instead of having someone do it, you can get an animation or someone just showing their hands as when they're doing something, that will help not only reduce the cost, but also will help people to see that as something that it was created for them. So it's more culturally appropriate. And some other questions that are key at the beginning of the process is, if you want that audio localized or only subtitle. And some videos or some audios will need that human touch. Like, for example, marketing and sales modules tend to be more prone to need that human voice and that marketing voice. And that means that it will need to be reviewed and approved before even going to recording. And also making changes to that will be very costly. But on the other hand, if it's something more technical or more a regulatory video, that a text-to-speech engine can be helpful for that, because you will only need to show those actions, or you like the purpose, it's completely different. So it will give more flexibility, and it will decrease your costs in the longer term.
One other point about videos and the use of subtitles, particularly in how-to videos, is consider how it's going to look to the user in the end. If your video is of somebody doing something in the bottom third of the screen, and that's where the subtitles go, then that might be a problem. So we've had that with a number of clients. Just think, how is it going to work? How is it going to look? And build that into your decision-making process.
You would also want to consider which approach is right for your market when it comes to video localization. In certain markets, it may be more acceptable to use text-to-speech, so AI voices versus a human voice. And again, your in-market salespeople, they might be able to best advise if that is acceptable or not. But you also have to ensure that it matches the content of the video. So yeah, a marketing video potentially must have a more nuanced performance and delivery than something that is perhaps quite a dry sort of instruction video that has to be functional rather than beautiful. So consider all those aspects for video, and use the tools that will match that goal.
And we've talked about various technological tools. There are a lot of technological tools coming out all the time for people to localize, translate. How can people start to incorporate those technologies while making the courses that they're making now future-proof?
I think it's a really interesting point, and it's difficult because I think there's a lot of technology that's in its infancy. Augmented reality, virtual reality still aren't really that mainstream. but are things that manufacturing clients in particular might be interested in to help them upskill their workforce or deliver very technically demanding training. There's also content-based tools as well that might, for example, be able to take structured DITA or XML content that creates user manuals or user guides and makes a video of that. So I think it's really having a look and always trying to keep up to date with what tools are out there, what's up and coming, and what might be of interest to you in the future, because yeah, it's ever evolving and rapidly changing.
I'm going to spring something on you here. Just to wrap up, what kind of top tip or takeaway from the discussion today would you each like viewers to come away with?
My top tip would be, for learning content, the most important thing is that your learner understands the message, understands the concept that you're trying to teach. And one of the easiest ways to ensure that's successful is by using simple, concise language, plain language, that there's no room for ambiguity or error, because it's not just the learner that needs to understand it, the translator needs to understand it as well. So you have this two-step process, and the more that you can remove ambiguity or potential for error, the more likely your content is to be successful.
I would suggest that involving your language service provider early on in the process is my best tip, as we can help think about the process from start to finish, help prevent certain issues occurring later on, ensure that the design of the course meets or is well suited for localization, as well as plan for the testing and QA steps, which is something that a lot of clients forget to do and plan for.
I think related to that, to consulting your LSP, is also making all the questions, thinking about every bit of content you are doing and thinking, is this appropriate for localization? Can this be scaled later on during the process? And making those questions and planning for all those events.
Yeah, I also think that knowing your audience, how they're going to be learning the content from the beginning, can help you choose what tools that you will potentially need for localization.